Online users are constantly asked to make choices. What product do you want to buy? What price are you willing to pay for it? What add-ons would you like to select? Who do you want to interact with online? How would you like to be contacted? And of course, what information about yourself are you willing to disclose? And the design of online interfaces really has a critical impact on the choices that users actually make. And this form of user experience or UX design is often referred to as online choice architecture. And it can be really positive. If it's done in the right way, it empowers users to make the right choices. They receive the information they want to receive at the right time. They have freedom of choice about what options they want to select. But over the last few years, there's been an increasing recognition that some common design practices can influence users' decision-making in a way that they wouldn't expect or a way that they wouldn't want. And these slightly more deceptive design choices are often called dark patterns, although as we'll see here, there's a whole world of vocabulary in relation to this aspect of UX. So there's lots of different definitions of dark patterns in legislation, in regulatory guidance, and indeed in the UX community itself. I think this recital to the DSA has quite a nice definition that really encompasses what we're talking about, in that it talks about distortions or impairment on the ability of users to make autonomous decisions and make informed choices. Now, this is a big topic. And there's obviously a whole range of laws which regulate dark patterns, from competition laws to consumer protection laws, looking at pricing, to the DSA, to the AI Act, and that's a whole topic in itself. We're obviously interested in data protection and the GDPR. And the GDPR itself doesn't define dark patterns. It doesn't define online choice architecture. But those practices are engaged by a number of its provisions, sometimes in quite specific ways. So when we can consider the fairness principle, the idea of fairness at the heart of the principle is the idea that you're supposed to operate in a way that meets the reasonable expectation of users and doesn't have an adverse impact on them. Well, if you're engaged in design practices that have manipulation or deception or trickery involved, that very likely engages the fairness principle. Similarly, transparency is all about the provision of information to data subjects. Now, we've always been told, don't bury critical information deep down in a privacy policy. Layer your privacy notices, use just-in-time notices, maybe use a pop-up or a video or an icon. Well, those are all design choices. And if you do it, again, in a deceptive way, using a dark pattern, you're going to have trouble with the transparency provision. Now, consent is absolutely key. And engages a lot of the interest of data protection authorities. For many services, getting a critical mass of people consenting is critical to the actual financial viability of the service. You might need a certain amount of people agreeing to targeted advertising to make it viable. You might need people to share their data widely in order to make the service work properly. And when it comes to consent, as we all know, there's a very high bar for validity, so informed, specific, unambiguous. But this is also actually an area where the GDPR gets quite specific into design choices, because it actually talks about presentation of consent information separately from other information. It talks about things like not using pre-ticked boxes in your default settings. So the GDPR is actually getting into the weeds of design a little bit here in quite an interesting way. Data minimization is important. You're only supposed to collect the data you need for the purpose for which you need it. You might have, again, an online service that's set up in such a way that you want people to give as much data as possible and you want it to be shared as widely as possible. Now, you might look to encourage your users to do that, but there's a fine line between encouragement and deception. And then finally, you have these twin principles of data protection by design and data protection by default. Those are all about planning and design and embedding those privacy practices at an early stage. And also they bring in the idea of the way you use default settings to get users to do what you want. And clearly, if you do it in a deceptive way, Article 24 or 25 are going to be engaged there as well. So who's been interested in this? Unsurprisingly, a whole range of regulators and consumer bodies have taken an active interest. one of the first reports looking at dark patterns from a privacy perspective that actually came back in 2018 by the Norwegian Consumer Council, which did a bit of a deep dive into alleged dark patterns being used on Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. It was quite an interesting report, got a bit of press. And then we had, and this is our DP Top 10 bingo card, we see NOYB again. They did, you're probably aware, quite an effective campaign in 2021 and 2022, where they were writing to organizations about their cookie consent practices. And they were asking them to make certain changes to bring the consent into, to make the consent valid. Now, that was ad tech focused, but it brought in issues of dark patterns because it was looking at the question of parity of choice between accepting cookies and rejecting cookies. It was looking at the color choices that organizations were using to nudge users in a particular direction. There's a really interesting piece of EDPB guidance, quite long, it's about 90 pages or so, on dark patterns. Again, another deep dive. They look at about 20 or 25 different dark pattern practices. That's well worth your time as well. But the big development this year has actually been in the UK, because we had a very interesting report in August last year, a joint effort between the ICO and the Competition and Markets Authority looking at privacy risks in relation to dark patterns. Now, that picked out some more obvious privacy risks like unwarranted intrusion into people's lives, loss of control and autonomy over data. But I also think there was a couple of interesting points that they really focused on. One was about really stressing the cost and effort implications for users if you make them work so hard to express their choices. It's just taking more of their time, and that has a significant impact on the fairness principle. And then also, and I thought this was particularly interesting, there was a real focus on the risk of normalizing bad behavior across the marketplace. So if users start to expect that online services are going to be set up this way, well, then maybe these kind of slightly more deceptive practices become within their reasonable expectations, and that obviously has an impact for what I was talking about before. So that was just a really interesting area of focus. What we saw after that was the ICO also engaged on the ad tech side, on the cookie practices, writing to the top 100 websites in the UK, requiring them to have the reject all cookies at the same level of the cookie pop-up as accept all cookies. Again, that forms part of a wider piece of work around ad tech, but it's a classic example of a dark pattern, of a deceptive practice. So I thought we'd just finish by quickly looking at 4 examples of some of the more common practices highlighted by the CMA and the ICO in their report. Some of these are subtle, some of these are less subtle. The first is harmful nudges. That's one of the most common forms of dark pattern. A nudge is essentially where a digital service is just trying to make it easy for you to take the decision they'd like you to make. There's lots of forms of this. The obvious one, and I've talked about this already, is the accept all, reject all piece. So I want to reject cookies. I can't do that at the first click. I've got to go set preferences or manage choices, go to a second layer to do that. Whereas the easy option that I'm being nudged towards is to agree. And just to make that extra clear, maybe that's in green or in bold, with the other option sort of grayed out. So that's a common example. And then the other side of the coin is sludge. So this is the idea that you give them the easy option and then you introduce friction on the other side of the coin. So in our previous screen, we see, manage choices. These guys go a bit further. They use the word configure. That sounds a bit technical, like that might take a little while. And just to really reinforce the point, they make clear that's going to take you about 4 minutes to do. This is actually a real one. I've kind of blocked out their name just to spare embarrassment. The third piece, confirm shaming. This is all about language. So using pressuring language to make users feel guilty about taking the choice you don't want them to make. So I'd like to pay full price. I'm not interested in savings. I want to remain ignorant about great offers. But I did say some of these were less subtle than others. And then sometimes it's just a final example. Sometimes you see confusing language and confusing placement of buttons. So do not uncheck this box. Well, the box is already unchecked, so I'm immediately confused. It feels a bit like a double negative. I've already spent too long on this. Just get me to the service. Fine, sure, whatever. And then the second example, we've got an accept button. Obviously, there's no reject button here, but we've also got this curious X in the top right-hand corner. Does that mean reject? It might mean reject. Maybe I'll click it. Probably doesn't mean reject. It probably just means accept or move on. So this is a classic example of just the way the options are presented being designed to confuse users. Now, that's probably all I've got time for. Just to kind of flag, there's loads more to explore here. You get into the world of graphic design, behavioral psychology. There's weird and wonderful terminology. As I said, the EDPB report is a really good read. But well, come and chat to me afterwards. I'd like to dig into some of these points with you. And just to, as I pass on to the next speaker, I'll just leave you with your options for what happens next. Thank you very much.